First, I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. I know we've had a packed first day, actually a packed first couple of days. We have a pretty tight schedule this morning when we've got a great topic that we are going to be touching on. Going to be traveling along some pretty interesting pathways as far as talking about automation. Over the past few years, being at Phacilitate and other conferences that are focusing on cell-based therapies, manufacturing cell-based therapies, one of the topics that we sort of continue to hear is, when do we automate? And how do we automate? And a common theme there is, well, you know, we really want to get to the finish line. We sort of see the path to commercial scale automation, but we need to get to the finish line first. We need to get our therapy approved, and then we'll consider that later. Well, with the approval of Yescarta and Kymriah in 2018, that later has suddenly become now. So we feel, the topic of today's discussion is pretty timely, looking at those pathways to commercial automation. And what we pulled together this morning, I think, is a really good panel to talk about their journeys to commercial automation. So without further ado, I'll introduce the panelists. We have Randy Schweikart. Randy is the Director of Engineering for Juno Therapeutics. Next to Randy is Steve Goodman, and Steve is the Head of Drug Product Manufacturing for Bluebird Bio. And on the end is Brian Hampson. Brian is the VP of Global Manufacturing Sciences and Technology for what formerly was PCT, but is now Hitachi Chemical Advanced Therapeutics Services. There we go. We just call it HCATS. So with that, let's jump right into it. So one of the first questions, and I think it's probably something that every organization really thinks about, churns over in meetings, is why automate? Why go through that process when you have a manual process right now that you may have inherited, you're making product, you're going through the approval process, you've gotten approval, why automate? Randy?
One of the reasons that is very important to us right now as we are rapidly ramping up our manufacturing is associated with operator safety. We are in a situation where we have a number of employees who now have ergonomic issues with their elbows, wrists, and so forth from all the manual operations that are done in BSC and so forth. And these are operations which are repetitive. They are things that can be done exactly the same, should be done exactly the same again and again and again. Mm-hmm. Human body's not really made to do that and reacts in bad ways, ergonomic issues. So one key advantage of an automated system is, in fact, to be able to execute those steps in a way such that the operator does not have to do that. And to be honest, what is one of our biggest issues we have in our manufacturing area right now.
Okay. From Bluebird's perspective, I know there are really two different programs, different cell types that you're working with. From the manufacturing perspective, what were your considerations for automating?
For us, I think the major driver for automation has been consistency and robustness. We already deal with a tremendous amount of variation in the process, just inherent to the types of cells and disease states that we work with. So using automation to take the variability that comes from manual manipulation and having a machine that can consistently deliver against a protocol, taking that manual interface out also helps to look at COGS improvements. Obviously, right, that's a huge driver. Is the manpower that has to go into supporting a process. As we look at scaling out, you start having to add more and more people to replicate the same process over and over again. So the more that we're able to get a machine or equipment to perform those tasks, the easier it will be to have the right people focusing on the right portions of the operation instead of the ones, as Randy said, that become routine and overly ergonomically challenging.
Okay, and Brian, from a CDMO's perspective, is that any different? You know, is the thinking any different around automation, seeing as how you're working with, you know, some your pharma partners, and maybe having those processes transferred over to HCATS?
Yeah, you know, fundamentally, I don't think there's any major differences in how you got to think about this. You know, the quality aspects of what automation can do, and you know, we want to have our people not needing to focus on very tedious manual operations, but you know, being able to turn those over to systems that can do that. You know, I do want to, you know, talk to the cost of goods piece of this, which certainly is, you know, a theme we're hearing. You know, we've created medicines with a sufficient efficacy that we can't afford to deliver them. I think that was basically Anthony Davies' quote. But you know, when automation, you know, maybe it's obvious that, well, we're going to have less labor, right, by having machine do something as opposed to a person. But there's other facets of cost reduction that happen. For instance, quality events. You know, when things are manual, you tend to produce quality events, and every quality event takes many hours to process. And so even if you don't take labor out because the person still has to, you know, be associated with machine, by reducing how many times there are quality events, that is a huge reduction. And then ultimately, if you can, as part of an automation platform, also bring this into a totally closed system, and can even go to simpler facility infrastructure, it's another huge cost reduction in the indirect costs, if you will. So there's just lots of opportunities across quality and cost of goods, and then scaling all of this. You know, there won't be enough people to run these manual processes when you get there, right? So those are some of the things that are why we pursue automation.
Okay, great. Yeah, that you brought up an interesting point, because I think that was something that Randy, you had touched on a little bit about, you know, the people, and you know, what you're thinking it may take to get to scale with the process of a manual open process. I know you were talking about adding a couple hundred trained people, so big challenge there. We've touched on a couple of pain points. You know, after you've decided to make that journey or start that journey to automate, you touched on a couple of pain points. Steve, I'll start with you. Can you talk about some others that, as you started to look at really a map of automation and how you wanted to implement, what are some of the things that kind of jumped out at you that you didn't really expect when you started to think about this?
Yeah, so I think the two others that I was thinking about when Randy and Brian were talking, I think naturally, based on our backgrounds, think about the manufacturing process. But the QC aspect is as important, if not more important, right, in terms of the duration that QC process takes after the manufacturing run is done, and the number of people who are working in a QC lab to take the samples, prepare the samples consistently, and then run them, is a huge opportunity for cost and consistency that I think is highly overlooked by the industry. I think that when you walk around the vendors' pavilion upstairs, you'll see a lot of efforts around the process automation, and I think there's a huge opportunity around automating QC, both for release testing, but also in process, moving more towards inline analytics, ones that are non-destructive. I'm guessing that everyone will agree, right? All of those cells that we have are precious, and QC consumes a huge proportion of cells that really, in the end, are better served going into the patient. So the more that we're able to non-destructively analyze and learn from our process, the better. I would also say maybe, sorry if I can continue
No,
one
go
more,
ahead.
is the data piece, right? A lot of data is generated in the process that we're only capturing a small portion in almost exclusively paper batch records, right? So the shift from paper batch records to electronic batch records will be huge, right? And it then opens up huge opportunities in terms of how we actually execute the process by making it less about being in the room and having a potentially a control center outside of a clean room space. That then gets back into the ergonomics piece of having operators in a grade B space. But then how do you actually start piecing together the data flow between pieces of equipment so that you're getting that rich data set into a cohesive and digestible format?
And if I could jump in here real quick and talk about even beyond, I think one of the key visions that we have about the manufacturing that we're trying to implement is in fact the ability to provide vertical integration. And you started going there, Stephen, with the idea that with the data integration, people understand that this is critical data that we need to get somewhere, in the right place, whether that be the batch record. But ultimately, when you talk about a manufacturing environment, there is a much larger integration that you need to see happen. And coming from Amgen, where we had these large manufacturing facilities, you understand with the vertical integration that the pieces of equipment, yes, they're executing your immediate process, right? But there is a process monitoring. It's actually a regulatory requirement that is associated with getting that information into a place, and you can have that distributed amongst many operators and engineers who are overlooking the process. Or you can integrate that, in fact, into a vertical system that provides that information in through your MES, your manufacturing execution system, into your, in fact, ERP system. And those kind of control systems associated with scheduling and monitoring your controls throughout what is going to be global operations. I mean, think about that. We're going to have multiple locations where we have these operations going on. You're going to have scheduling activities that need to occur, which is, when I have a client who's in this location, do I want to send that, the blood this direction, apheresis this site, or this site? That's the kind of decisions that can be made when you have the centralized information. And the automation is the key linkage, can be the key linkage between that process, that immediate process that's going on, and that information that needs to be at the corporate, even the corporate level, to be making kinds of decisions that make a very efficient process.
So I'm trying to digest that a little bit, but then thinking about also working with a partner like HCATS as a contract manufacturer. How do you look at pain points both from your partner's process, looking at that process that's going to be transferred over, but also consider the capabilities that you have in-house? Through all those factors, so the ergonomics, IT, quality.
Yeah, it's definitely a give and take with each individual client. There's definitely, we have clients who are, their interest is to be in the clinic, right, and to generate clinical data. And we have nice solutions and evolving solutions that bring automation and closed systems in, but in some cases, we say that's interesting. We want to defer that. Now, what we advise our clients is there are some things you can defer, but one of the things you want to focus on is where there's, I'll call it, high comparability risk. And where there's high comparability risk, if you were to delay changing to automation, let's do that now. And typically that's in your core processes, right? I mean, it's the journey the cells that are on. If something about the cell journey is going to change or likely to change drastically when you go to automation, let's do that early so that we don't have to deal with that. Okay, test automation, I'll call it factory automation, that some of the things we're talking about, vertical integration and information automation, those don't have direct comparability risk to the cells. You gotta build that all up as you go towards the commercial finish line. But first start with those key core processes and get into closed automation early. I get it that, there's a trade-off of cash flow that, where do you want to spend your money, particularly early on in clinical trials when you don't know exactly how well your product's going to work and you don't want to spend too much money. So trying to find that right balance with a client, yet, they have their clinical milestones that they got to deliver on, and we get that. One other comment I wanted to make about automation, and it was starting to be alluded to, is the risks that start to occur, particularly as scale out, happens, particularly chain of identity of, the patient material, as well as chain of identity of samples and everything that's flying through a manufacturing facility. When you're doing a few products at a time, that you say, well, how could it happen that one person's cells goes into the wrong person? Well, yeah, but when you start thinking of doing that thousands of times a year, these risks elevate substantially, and I think automation has a huge role to play in maintaining electronically chain of custody from the patient all the way back to the patient. Technologies like RFID and how those get integrated with your system, so things never get mixed up.
And do you see some of those technologies being implemented, so going beyond, say, barcodes, using RFID? Is that something you're seeing right now, or is that?
I would say at this point more aspirational. In my previous history, had done some implementation of an equivalent of RFID in a manufacturing process where actually a tag followed the process and the systems read it periodically, so I've seen the power of it, but it hasn't come to fruition yet, and I think it's got to get there. The use of technology across the whole cell journey. I don't think we can live without it. I think we haven't been treating enough patients yet for it to become an emergency, but it will be.
Okay. You made a comment about where you spend your money, and that's very important. For Steve and Randy, thinking about the overall approach, so we talked about pain points and talking about where you spend your money. So you've made that decision, you've mapped this out, you've looked at pain points. Where do you spend your money? What's the overall approach to starting this and implementing automation? Steve, go ahead. Yeah.
So Bluebird's trying to take a phased approach. We are looking at de-risking and implementing. So I should back up. We actually have done a reasonable amount of automation during our clinical studies. And so now, as we're going towards commercial, for us, it's more about how do we start integrating the individual unit operations, I guess horizontally, as a way to enable supporting greater numbers of patients as we get into commercial manufacturing. So that's kind of our near-term goal. There's a few steps that we want to continue to optimize and close through automation, and then kind of building around a manufacturing execution system around our process that will have very minimal regulatory impact from a comparability perspective. So how do we essentially start linking up our unit operations to make it simpler to run, but very low implementation risk. Then we're looking at it more long-term for how are we then evaluating both the existing technology that's out there and helping to direct the future of equipment and product development to meet our future needs and develop a platform for that next generation of products. Because I think, like many here, getting through the clinical proof of concept has been so important that we've made incremental changes over time to our existing products. And now that we see the potential being realized across the industry, we can then make that investment for a longer-term platform solution. We are looking at it both from, is there a solution in a box, right? Something that is end-to-end versus optimizing specific unit operations that can then be consistently brought together and performed kind of in a uniform fashion. My design principle is around if you can design it as if you were going to run this in any hospital around the world in a decentralized fashion, then you've built in the robustness that will allow you to do a centralized or decentralized manufacturing. So that's kind of from a design principle for automation in a next-gen platform, the approach we're using, and then that gives us ultimate flexibility in how we implement.
Okay. How does Juno look at this?
Well, I have to say Celgene.
Oh,
know.
sorry. Juno, Celgene. Is there a next one?
So I think I look at it on two levels. One level definitely is kind of a top-down, and this is kind of the corporate infrastructure that is definitely part of the manufacturing that Celgene completely understands, and in fact is to some extent says that must be there from the top down. This is the vertical integration. My role and a role that I think is real important for fitting into that is somewhat what Stephen was talking about, was the design of the automation, the plant automation to fit within the larger data infrastructure that's being provided by the corporate. And it's kind of interesting because I would have thought that this was something that was obvious and ready to implement, and you just hook this thing up here and you hook this thing up here. But in this industry in particular, we have these pieces of equipment that tend to be benchtop unit operations. That's how they were developed, and they have key functionalities and they have internal automation maybe within them, some steps and so forth that are executed, but they're not designed with the idea that they are going to exist within a much larger and completely networked environment, a manufacturing environment. And that, in fact, is the role I play, as much as I play in terms of defining the key automation within the function that needs to occur. It's actually the supervisory control and the linkages of the automation into our network systems. That is where I have to apply pressure both inside my company to say, you have to realize that this needs to communicate outwards, as well as the vendors that we work with, and say, make sure that when you develop that piece of equipment, I understand you're developing it because these key clinicians, they need to have this functionality. Make sure when you do that you have your linkages outward and upward, because that's going to be key to really our being able to incorporate it into our manufacturing enterprise. So I think that's the key investment we're doing within my organization is how do we develop that connectivity. And I think I think we do have a much more kind of a reconfigurable idea, as opposed to the idea that we could deploy an integrated system, POC. I don't think we have kind of that perspective on it. It may come from the fact that it's more an optimization of the individual unit operations, and so the idea is more is, do we have a reconfigurable system? So part of what the automation does, and Stephen was referring to how we have this horizontal integration, by having a flexible supervisory control layer around the automation, I'm able to put the unit operations where I need them or swap in a particular unit operation for the next therapy. So that's kind of the approach that we're taking.
Interesting. So when you both hit on a really interesting point about working with vendors. And Brian, I'll throw this one out to you as well. How do you work with vendors? Because you're looking at different instruments, different systems, instruments that don't talk to each other. Talk a little bit about how you're working with those partners, what your expectations are.
Maybe this is where maybe a CDMO has a different opportunity. Maybe if I can say it versus the cell therapy developers. But we look to the vendors to be our partners, because we're looking to create platform solutions that can be applied in different situations. I mean, the classic trade-off between buy versus build. Do you need to develop a custom automation platform, or can something that already exists be applied? I mean, I think there's going to be a balance there. I mean, there's so many different types of cell therapies right now, and perhaps that's going to continue for a long time. So I think we have to have configurable platforms. But my point is, collaborating with the people that are developing automation systems. And of course, we have a collaboration with Invetech, actually, as one good example. That's very important to us, because we view ourselves as I'll call it applications experts across the range of processes, but we're not software engineers and electrical engineers and mechanical engineers that do, I'll call it, hard engineering, and we need a partner like Invetech and in the software realm, other folks that can help us build the digital infrastructure that we need. And I think some more of that collaboration and partnering has to happen, realizing that everybody wants to protect their IP and their class. So it's and everybody has to win in the end, right? We have to do this in a way that everybody is growing their business. I mean, we're all at least most of us are in a business to make money, and how do we do that with each other?
Sure. So, Steve, any comments from Bluebird's perspective?
Sure, yeah. So we approach the collaboration with vendors in the sense of trying to provide at a very early stage the kind of user requirements, right? What are we looking for from a solution? So we're like exactly what we're talking about today, right? What are our pain points? What do we need from our system to be able to operate our processes in the way we need to? And then we gravitate, honestly, to the ones that listen and the ones that are thinking about the industry and gathering that feedback across a number of suppliers. I don't necessarily see the value of each one of these companies, our companies, having bespoke solutions, right, that then don't apply. It becomes a nightmare ecosystem across the field to have all of these very bespoke solutions that, as a CDMO, I can only imagine managing a myriad of equipment for each individual client. And likewise, right as you try to grow, you're then trying to transition between all of these highly customized solutions, as opposed to, can we develop things that are applicable across a number of different applications and indications that service the same as Juno cell gene as it would for Bluebird, right? And so it's gravitating towards those vendors who are, they really have the opportunity to talk to a number of different cell developers and listen to those pain points, and then collectively think about what does a solution that meets multiple needs. I think is the approach so that's the approach that I endorse for Bluebird, that really tries to look at it from an industry perspective. How are we really furthering the whole thing, as opposed to just, I'm actually less concerned about an IP position for ours, because I think our IP is deeper. It's not specific to the equipment we're using. It's the indication and the technology in that I think is most important.
Your thoughts, Randy?
I think you just touched on something I think that is really interesting about my perception of the industry, is that we do consider how we do the process part of what's the differentiating factor, and what equipment used to some extent. And coming from the antibody world, where things had pretty much gelled across the industry as to how we basically do processing, is a little bit different than what I've experienced. I think one of the approaches that we're taking is with vendors is that we are doing some development, which we consider differentiating. But the perspective that we would have with the vendors, especially if they're a small vendor developing some technology that our investment in them is what's going to allow them to actually for them to be commercially viable, is to think we're not going to have exclusivity around that particular technology. That's not the development we want to have, because we understand for this technology to actually be useful broadly, and for it to be successful, I should say, it has to be used broadly. And so we develop the technology with the understanding and agreements that are put in place to say, we in fact, at some point in time, want you to go out and talk about this technology more broadly, and how this can be used in our industry to advance the automation aspect, all the things we talked about, the pain points that we talked about. But I do want to say that there's two approaches that we have with vendors. One is the Invetech design build situation. I think you come with the user requirements, you end up pretty much with a bespoke, hopefully broadly useful bespoke solution, if you will. But the other is working with vendors who have a very standard product or options associated with their product. And what we're really just looking to do is to say, how can we work with the vendor to make this more integratable into our systems, whether that's horizontally or vertically. And we're very much working with the vendor in exactly what they're providing, but we're just adding a little tweak here in terms of the connectivity, perhaps.
Okay. Well, let's unwrap that a little bit, because you both hit on an interesting point, talking a little bit about new technologies. How do you, when you look at new technologies, and the landscape is always growing, how do you integrate or even think about integrating new technologies into an automation plan? Do you start with process development? Are you sort of scoping and sensing what's out there? Talk a little bit about that. And Randy, you're on a roll, Randy. So keep you going.
So in the way we are organized at Juno Celgene in terms of development, we have parallel organizations with process development and then what we call technology development. And so in the technology development, we're looking at platforms, some early processes, but mostly it's platform technologies. And so we have to actually prove the technology. We have to go through that governance to prove that we have a technology that's ready to be implemented, and that's in parallel to a process that's coming along, a new therapy that's coming along that's being developed. And they're supposed to end up at the same point, at the same time, to say we're ready to move forward with this process, and we have the technology, the new technology we want to integrate into that process. But anyone who's worked in the field knows that if I have a technology, I'm trying to find my PD folks and saying, here's my technology, I want you to use it as soon as possible, because it's always the therapy, the process that goes forward. It's not the technology. Now, we're hoping that the technologies that we develop for our early development, that those technologies, once they prove themselves in early clinical settings, we can now push them into what are our late stage programs by showing that they're robust. And that's really kind of the approach that we take. The technologies that we develop and bring in-house or from external and are adapting to our processes will be moved into our early pipeline. And then once we prove that these are robust processes, which is always the key, it's one thing to be functionally capable, but robust is another absolutely key factor. That robustness is what allows us to now say, okay, what would it take, especially from a regulatory perspective, to get this into our very late stage and commercial products.
Okay. Brian, I get the impression sometimes with CDMOs in particular that implementing new technologies may be a bit of a challenge, because of the partnership between your clients and yourself. Is that the case, or how does HCATS look at new technologies?
Well, so first of all, we actually, as a matter of fact, and the reason I'm actually at HCATS is 5 or 6 years ago, Bob Preddy had the vision to establish an innovation and engineering group that was saying, okay, we're a client service business, but we also need to be looking towards the future, and let's carve out some of our talent to be not driven by client contracts, but by looking for new technologies and developing them. Matter of fact, again, the collaboration with you is in that category. But we're looking to bring new technologies in, and particularly those that are, I'll call, automatable. That's one of our fundamental questions is, how, and it's a combination of, are they amenable to closed system approaches, to being robust, as you were noting, but investing in those and then presenting those solutions to our clients as they evolve. And you're right, sometimes our client has a very, very specific set of requirements, but we hope to steer that in the future. We find as a CDMO that because we're facing a lot of different parts of the cell therapy market, vendors are interested to work with us because we can present the solutions across a broad spectrum, and to some extent, have I'll call it standardized platforms, but I think they got to be highly configurable standardized platforms. Where does configurable just transition into being custom and bespoke? But I think I don't think we'll ever get to where maybe monoclonal antibodies are, right? Where you can have the monoclonal over here in your manufacturing process over here, and they're not interlinked. But in cell therapy, they're so. I don't like to say the process is the product. I mean, I think we need to understand our product is heavily influenced by the process. But we have to. I think for this industry to get where it needs to be over the years, have some good platforms in place that can be used. I mean, there's just so many companies that are going to need to draw on these as time goes by. And I think, it will be everybody's friend, and I think you were alluding to this, when a platform's not just used here, but it's used here, here, and here, because it creates a lot of, experience and collective knowledge on that platform versus it being just for this particular process, because then it's hard to maintain that and to improve it and evolve it when it's only being used in one situation. And so that's what we hope to do is create platforms and indeed automation platforms as a C. But we got to invest. Our acquisition by Hitachi helped us in that regard because we have access to capital, to do that. I still have to justify return on investment just like anybody does, but we have the resources to do that.
Steve, your thoughts?
I was actually lost in listening. Reframe the question, please.
So,
Sorry, I really was. Please.
Sure. So, integrating new technologies. So how does Bluebird look at integrating new technologies? Are you focusing primarily with the process development team, saying here's something new?
Yeah. So we do exactly that, and I think Randy spoke to it quite well. There are so many technology developers out there, right, that want their systems evaluated across different cell types and performance, that we could have an entire team at Bluebird just to evaluate the myriad of technologies that are out there. So we do a lot of screening of the landscape of what's out there on paper, and evaluate the pluses and minuses and how they would apply to our processes. We then start collaborations to do beta testing of systems, but also to provide that kind of feedback that I was talking about before, to make adjustments based on that, both on our paper evaluation of what we need, where are the gaps for a second generation type prototype, and then we'll usually bring the technology in-house to do further evaluation. That's both on the process side as well as on the QC side. I think I want to keep pushing Bluebird to consider even further out on the QC side what the kind of third, fourth generation of technology is out there. We have depended heavily, I guess, on what technology is currently out there, but there's a huge opportunity that I think industry-wide to be looking across not just what we do in cell therapy, but in other fields as well, to enhance our understanding of these cellular processes and products that we're not doing a strong enough job on. I think there's a good amount of tension in the industry on the process, but the QC aspect, I think, is falling short.
That's an excellent point. So that takes us to our last question here, our last topic. And Steve, that was actually a pretty good segue into this. We're going to touch on this and then open up the floor for questions. So we talked a little bit about integrating new technologies. We've talked a little bit about communications, IT. We've talked about the path. So the now is understand sort of your pain points, how you want to map this, how you want to implement it. We talked a little bit about the near-term future with integrating new technologies. Now let's take a step beyond that. Okay, where else do we go? And talk a little bit about standards. So what are your thoughts on standards development? Where do we think that there's a priority to look at standards? And how do you think about implementing standards across manufacturing? I'll start with you, Steve, since that was something that you brought up in one of our pre-panel discussions, and you were pretty passionate about that.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of opportunities around standardization. Specific to the topic around automation, I think actually Randy touched on it a couple questions ago, and that's really how do we start integrate the systems from a data perspective, so both in terms of access to the software and then access to the data. I think each vendor is approaching this as they're thinking about almost like their little island, right? And they're not thinking about the ecosystem of how these pieces need to come together from a cell developer perspective. And so creating a standard in terms of, whether it's, and I'm not a software or technology engineer, but how do you actually create the APIs and whatnot, or the access to the electronic systems within, so you can control it centrally, have access to the data, and the different individual islands can actually start communicating with one another. I think that's somewhere where it's a relatively, from an IP perspective, I think it's a relatively low bar, but it unlocks a huge amount of potential in the way we operate in a clean room.
Randy?
Yeah, I was going to say the 2025 NCMC document you helped point me towards and say, look at the standard. How does this look in terms of a standard development tool? And I think in a lot of ways it is a really good tool. The consortium was brought together to address a lot of the manufacturing issues that exist. And I just wrote down a few of the key goals. They include, a centralized control capability for multi-parallel operations. There was also even discussions about, ability to connect upward into your MES and ERP systems. But again, that was a goal like in 2025, something like that. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like you said at the beginning, that's now. We got to make it happen now, right? Anyways, but there's there's some good specific goals that it has in the document that I think are absolutely something that we should focus on. So it's good to have the consortium talk about those kinds of things as general goals. But when I look to the standards that were captured in the document, there was the regulatory standards, supply chain standards, product quality standards. So those are key, real important standards. But there was nothing about the automation. There was nothing about data infrastructure or anything like that. And so I think those are the kinds of things that can also be very helpful. I'm going to throw one of these things out here, OPC UA for those folks. So I think what's amazing about the situation that we're in this industry is that we are actually creating an evolution in the supervisory control space, because what we have are these individual devices that have their own internal controllers that have to communicate as if you're in large-scale manufacturing. They have an accepted way that you communicate I/O to your devices. Well, we don't have that. We have individual microcontrollers that are controlling an individual device. We still need to get, as Stephen said, both the programming down, and we need to get the data back out. That still exists. And so now we're having to work with some of these companies, supervisory control companies, to say, if you want to be effective in this space, you have to evolve. You have to, what is the user interface going to look like, whether it's local or whether it's incorporated into the supervisory control? What is that communication path that you're going to have? And how are you going to make that as robust as you expect your systems to be when you have your direct linked I/O? So I think that's what's really exciting about this space, is that the standards that can be developed and how we work with not just our equipment vendors, but in fact our automation vendors, and saying you guys have to learn to work together to get this space to work as well as it has in the traditional manufacturing space. So it's a really exciting time.
Sure. Brian, thoughts?
Yeah, well, so I think connectivity is, one of the key points being made here, and it's even, the physical connectivity of unit operations from, flowing of transfer of cells from one unit operation to the next and standardizing that. And then the other point I want to make is just the standardization all the way out, from vein to vein, if you will, and the standardization that has to occur in the orchestration, if you will, of the whole supply chain of cells. And we're starting to see, companies that are addressing that type of thing, and making use of standards that are already out there, like the good automation practices, GAMP standards that or guidances that can help here. I mean, I think we're getting to the point where we need to make sure we're learning from what's already out there as well, and applying that into because they've solved this in other industries, right? And I'm not sure there's too many things that at least at the standards level that we can't learn from what's happening in monoclonals and biologics and even pharma, to tell you the truth.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's a great way to sort of open up the floor for questions. So we've got about 10 minutes for questions. We've got a couple of mics around the room. If you do have a question, one thing that I would ask is if you wait for the microphone so everyone can hear your thoughts. So we'll open the floor.
Hi there, Ken Bertram, Wake Forest. So the federal government spent a fair amount of money investing in two of the manufacturing institutes, Nimble being run in consortium with NIST, and BioFab USA being run in consortium with the DoD. Any comments on whether or not you think those are going to actually be able to deliver on standards that industry will be able to follow?
Steve, do you want to take that one or start that one?
Yeah, I can provide my thoughts. I'm not involved with either consortium. I do think that there's a huge opportunity and an open mindedness across the industry to be working towards these. So I would actually expect those to be able to align on some of these standards. I think those standards will come more towards, especially in like reference standards, targets for impurities and residuals and that sort of thing. So it's not necessarily specific to automation, although I do think that the more that we talk about those kind of topics here, the more likely that the individuals who sit on those governing groups will focus on those specific topics. And I do actually think that will drive some of the standardization in the industry.
Brian?
Yeah, I've had some involvement with, is my mic on? Some involvement with both BioFab USA and actually I want to mention the standards coordinating body that is a kind of a spin out of ARM where I'm seeing, I think, currently some good progress in establishing standards for cell therapy. But I think BioFab USA, I haven't been involved with Nimble, but I think, bringing a very wide set of people together is going to be required to get alignment, but it's going to be a slog because everybody's coming at it with different viewpoints. And it's, I think it's going to take some time, but I think it's going to get there. I think that the standards coordinating body, in my judgment, is leading the way right now with some of the standards work that's happening, in my opinion.
Randy?
I have much more familiarity with Nimble, and I think that the perspective, at least that I have on Nimble, is that it's very focused on needs, basically gaps in needs, technological needs that are there, and the focus is to get a broader community to support those specific needs, make sure they come forward. So I'm not sure how much standards per se are developed there, that you have the folks who need to be, developing technologies to meet specific needs, and that they become standardized because you find solutions as perhaps there. But in terms of the standards for interconnectivity and so forth, I'm not sure that's the right forum necessary for that.
Other questions?
Hi. As a regulatory lawyer, I hear a lot from clients that the current CGMP regs and the 211s are ill-suited for gene therapies, and I wanted to hear, which were created largely for small molecule drugs. I'd be interested to hear if you agree with that, and if so, what are the particular changes you think would be most needed, or examples of the particular 211 requirements that are most problematic for compliance, or do you think it's just FDA needs to be a little more flexible in its interpretation of the 211s?
Wow. Brian, I'll throw that one to you first.
Yeah. I guess at the level of the the principles of GMPs, that's what you're referring to, right? Just to confirm for folks in the audience, I have no problem, and we have no problem with following, the principles. But there are things about, processing cells that are different, of course, than a large molecule or small molecule drug. And I guess it's more about the FDA being adaptable to the specific situation and specific things that have to be different. I suppose one example from a number of years ago was just understanding that for fresh cell therapy products, you're going to have to treat a patient before you have all of your results, and they actually have written into the guidances some of the things that you have to do there, and sometimes there's very specific reasons where you can't even follow their guidance, and I found that the dialogue with the FDA with good rationale, I think that's the key as to why what you're trying to do is different. But I don't know whether should there be a new set of GMPs for cell therapy. That's a good question. I'm not sure I'd go there at this point, but maybe we should.
So I fully agree with that. I couldn't have said it better actually than Brian, but I do think there are some areas where there needs to be, maybe it does fall to this flexibility piece around how we interpret. I think there are some guidances, expectations right around like visual inspection. I'll use that as an example, where in biologics, there's a fairly standard process, right? When you're dealing with a cell therapy that needs to be cryopreserved within 30 to 45 minutes, right? And so you have a very limited window of opportunity to actually not only do the inspection, but even create the standards that would, because there's so much variability in that, and what are you looking for? And so actually agreeing that the controls might be upstream, right? And you're controlling your raw materials and your incoming material specifications such that you're maybe not having the same approach to visual inspection specification. I'm just using that as an example. It doesn't fall within the realm of automation per se, but I think that we do, right? I don't think we have trouble following GMP in a manufacturing environment as prescribed, but it's more about specific applications to the rules.
I think the one example, I think it's a collaboration. I think that when we say CGMP, a lot of it's what we impose upon ourselves, or a paradigm that we live within. And I think that one of the key, and where automation also fits in here, is in the situation where we need adaptable controls, right? One of the very unique aspects of what we do is the incoming material is very, very different every time, right? And so the ability to know that the way that I do processing may be different on this particular incoming material versus that incoming material, and the value of that, and how do we control that? Before the circumstance, quality by design, and all these things are around. How do we reduce that variability? Well, we're not going to be able to, in fact, the only way we reduce variability is by excluding patients. Well, that's not what we want to do. We want to be as inclusive as we can possibly be. Well, to be as inclusive as we can possibly be, that's as broad a spectrum as we can be in terms of our incoming material. So adaptable control of our processes is, I think, both what the regulatory agencies and the industry is trying to figure out how to make happen appropriately.
One final question, because I know we're kind of butting up against time. So,
yeah, James Halloran, Cambridge Consultants. The panel's spoken very eloquently around the benefits of moving to a more standardized production system across the industry, and the analogy with biologics is a good one. But how do we ensure that that doesn't stifle future innovation? And again, looking at biologics, I'd give the example how everybody's still making things in non-human cell lines, whereas doing things in human cell lines like HEX or Percy-6s might have been a better way forward, but the industry wasn't really willing to move that direction. It's in a little bit of stasis. So how do we ensure that there's still the drive to innovate and still retain that benefit of commonality of manufacturing platform?
I think that's a great question and a great way to sort of condense our thoughts. So, Steve and Randy, very quickly thinking about that.
So I think there's so much opportunity, right, to continue to improve that I don't think that the innovation will be stifled in the next 10 or 15 years. So I think that everyone recognizes, right, to get to the control and price point and reliability that we need to be for what we think is the opportunity in this field. I don't see that challenge now. I think I see where you're going down the road, right? At a certain point when we've overcome some of these really significant hurdles, like we get to the chip away the 80 or 90%, and how do you get that final 10% of where we need to go? It will be a challenge. I would say you'll have to come back to me in 5 or 10 years, because I don't think that's going to be an issue right now. I think there's so much attention to it, and there's so much opportunity to drive this forward that I think that it's a good long-term question.
Final thought.
So I think, the thing that's amazing to me in this industry is that the therapies themselves are moving so fast that I don't think we'll ever be in a situation where we had the monoclonal antibodies where things congealed enough and we had a platform and this is what the industry was and this is the way you did it. And there was some innovation here and there, but we got to a basic. The therapies are going to be innovating so fast now that I'm not sure we ever even get to that. The platforms will have to be so high level and again, the therapies are what's going to be driving that innovation. So. I agree with Stephen. I just see that we are going to be adapting to an incredibly fast evolution in this industry, and it's going to be the efficacy of the therapies that's going to drive all of the manufacturing and all of the process and everything. So that's why, to me, I just don't see it being an issue. This is an amazing industry to be in for innovation.
But I think that's a great way to wrap the panel up. Number one, I want to thank you panelists this morning. Great insights. And thank you audience for your engagement this morning. And we hope to see you as you all continue the journey. So thanks so much.